My name is Bonnie B, and you are watching The Power of Perseverance. So, welcome to my podcast today. We have today's guest, Dr. Thomas Weimbs, and he is the Chief Science Officer and Professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where he leads groundbreaking research on polycystic kidney disease. His career spans in decades, including significant discoveries in the dietary interventions for PDK. He is on the forefront of developing innovative therapies to support kidney health, and I'm so glad you're joining us today to tell us how your discoveries have led you to create the product and the work that you guys do at Santa Barbara Nutrients.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's great to be here.
So, in your work, what initially led you to start doing research in kidney disease in general? Was it a personal experience?
Yeah, good question. So just to clarify, so I'm a professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And I've directed a research lab for 20 plus years or so that has been focusing on a genetic form of kidney disease called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD for short. So initially we started this work a little bit by coincidence. Excuse me. So this was actually way back then at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, where I started out as an assistant professor. And I was approached by a family that has a PKD in their family, and they had close ties to the Cleveland Clinic at the time, and wanted to support research on PKD at the Cleveland Clinic. And nobody was doing research there on PKD. So they found out about this new assistant professor, and we had a meeting and several meetings, and came up with some ideas of things we could contribute in the lab. And this family then ended up funding research in my lab, which was great to give us a start. We looked at the what are the open questions in the field, in the research field, where could we contribute, and started to get to work. I hired a couple of people to work on it, and then we actually started to make some really good progress. Made some good discoveries. Started to publish papers. In my first big NIH grant from the National Institutes of Health was actually on polycystic kidney disease. So that's how it all started, and kept going strong ever since.
So you said in your research there were some key discoveries. What was some of the most significant findings your lab made about understanding the mechanisms of PKD? Excuse me.
PKD, yes. Right. So way back then when we started, there was obviously a whole lot less known than what's known today. But one thing that we found is a certain important signaling molecule and signaling pathway in the cell that's called the mTOR pathway, that turned out to be a driver of cyst growth in polycystic kidney disease. Maybe just to back up a little bit, what even is polycystic kidney disease? Not everyone may know this. So polycystic kidney disease is essentially a genetic disease. So in most cases, a patient would have inherited a mutated gene from one of their parents. So it runs in families. And the disease is usually slowly progressing, and patients eventually can progress all the way to kidney failure, oftentimes when they're in their 50s or 60s. The disease is essentially a form of chronic kidney disease, and as you know, chronic kidney disease is very common, affects about 10% of the population, and that's really worldwide. And most forms of chronic kidney disease are really caused by type 2 diabetes, metabolic disease, and so on. But polycystic kidney disease is really the root cause is initially this gene mutation. And one, peculiar thing, if you will, that happens in polycystic kidney disease is, in addition to, deteriorating of kidney function, there are thousands of these cysts that will grow in the kidneys, in both kidneys, and that eventually leads to the damage of the kidney and the destruction of the kidney tissue. And so what we had initially found, and that's probably now pretty much 20 years almost ago, is that this particular signaling pathway called mTOR plays really a driving role in the cyst growth in PKD. And interesting, at that time, there was already a drug available, a drug called rapamycin, that can inhibit mTOR very potently. And we were able to use this drug then in mice with polycystic kidney disease, and it was extremely potent. Really stopped the disease progression in those mice. So we published a paper that made a big splash and actually led very quickly also to clinical trials to test this particular drug, rapamycin, in people with polycystic kidney disease. So that was a very fast translation from bench to bedside, if you will. So unfortunately, it turned out once the trials were done, it turned out you can't really use an mTOR inhibitor like rapamycin in people with polycystic kidney disease because if the side effects are just too strong. And part of the problem is that mTOR is not only important in kidneys, but it's important pretty much everywhere in the body, right? So every single organ and tissue and cell in the body essentially uses mTOR. And if you just treat with a drug that blocks all mTOR in the entire human body, you have all kinds of extra-renal effects that are not wanted and lead to complications. And so essentially you cannot really treat people for a long time with rapamycin and only hope to have a beneficial effect on the kidneys. So that ended up being sort of a dead end. But nevertheless, it led us to additional research avenues, and they have been very fruitful and led to more recent discoveries.
So a couple of things I heard while you were sharing the timeline of discovery is basically the disease is genetically passed down and can mutate in all different kinds of ways. And it sounds like metabolic disease pushes it. And in past research, using these other methods aren't as natural to our body's processes. So therefore, long term, it wasn't a great solution for this disease. So through that discovery, when was that aha moment that you guys found beta hydroxybutyrate to be that key? Because it's only been around for so long, and beta hydroxybutyrate supports the signaling molecule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so great question. So there were a couple of aha moments, I would say, and everything happens over the course of a few years in the lab.
Not overnight.
No, not overnight, unfortunately. So there are always like careers involved. I have graduate students as they do their thesis research in the lab, and that takes like 5 years, let's say. I have postdoctoral researchers. They usually spend several years in the lab. So it's always a huge effort, and there's like teams involved and lots of blood, sweat, and tears. But one observation was so one of my graduate students had the idea to inhibit the mTOR pathway by essentially depleting nutrients from mice, if you will. So he just decided to feed our mice with polycystic kidney disease less food. And there are there's lots of connections. So mTOR is regulated not only by growth factors, but also by the nutrient status and the energy status of cells. So it sort of made sense, but I would never have thought that this would work. So he just did it anyway. And came one day and said, "Hey, I did this experiment. I put mice on a food restricted, feeding regimen, and the mice are happy and healthy, and their body weight growth didn't change. Everything is fine, except their polycystic kidneys didn't grow. So the cysts didn't grow anymore. So this was like a really striking result." With a extremely simple intervention. You just feed them less food, and it wasn't even dramatically a dramatic restriction. It was only 23% less food than the control group. So this was the first interesting aha moment where we said, something is happening. But we had to admit that we had actually no idea what really is going on mechanistically. So we published a paper saying this works, and why it works, we don't know. But then, of course, as scientists will do, you try to figure out why it actually works. So additional years go by, and we eventually figured that one out. And the next aha moment was essentially when we realized that the mice on a food restriction regimen actually changed their feeding behavior. Right, so in the control group always has free food available, as much as they want, any day of any time of the day and night. So they essentially just nibble here and there, and they're behaving similar to humans in Western societies. We eat all the time. We have, 3 big meals. We have snacks in between, and we never stop eating.
Well, food is just so convenient nowadays. The way, and then how it's made and processed. To keep fresh food, you have to have chemicals in it. It's not like you're just in a farm picking your own food like we did back in, the
exactly.
early.
And in our industrial societies, we have food available. It's in our fridge, it's in our pantry. Around the corner is going to be a grocery store and so on. So we're never out of food.
Never.
And that's similar to mice in a cage, in a research lab. However, when you restrict their food intake, the way this works is, you essentially calculate how much food they should eat in a day, and you weigh it out and you put it into the cage only once a day. So they get only food once a day. And they change their feeding behavior pretty dramatically because they consume everything all at once. So pretty much in one sitting, they eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner and all their snacks all within an hour or so. And then they're out of food for the rest of the day. So for the remaining 23 hours, they're actually fasting. So turned out that was actually the key, was the fasting. Because, when mice or humans, when we start fasting, our metabolism changes very dramatically. And we get into what's called ketosis, right? So ketosis happens, it's a metabolic switch in our body when we're carbohydrate restricted. So we don't eat any more carbohydrates like when we're fasting. Our liver starts producing ketones, and they ultimately come from the fat reserves, from our fat cells. And the ketones then take over the role of sugar, of the blood sugar. And that's exactly what happens in these mice if you put them on this type of food regimen. So we did, many more experiments. We found out that anytime you put mice or rats into ketosis, by different nutritional interventions, you get the same beneficial effect on these polycystic kidneys. So it always stops cyst growth and has no detrimental effect on the rest of the body. And you can do this with a ketogenic diet, for example, which is a very high-fat, very low-carb diet, where you don't even have to restrict calories at all. You don't have to restrict the timing of eating. You just change the food composition. And then, so this was like lots of interesting aha moments along the way. And then another one came when someone in the lab decided to just try supplementing these mice with beta hydroxybutyrate on top
How did
of
they
just
know to use beta hydroxybutyrate? Is it like a chemical you guys have available in the lab, or where, like, how would you
right.
just, are you taught that? Like, how would you just know?
Well, so I would not have again thought this would work. So I was kind of like, whatever, if you want to try it, go ahead, kind of thing. But the rationale is that beta hydroxybutyrate is the main ketone that is formed by the liver during ketosis. And it's an interesting molecule because it's not only an energy molecule, so it's not only kind of like taken up by cells and burned for energy, but it's also a very potent signaling molecule. So it's essentially a hormone, if you will. Beta hydroxybutyrate has its own receptor, and it can act on additional pathways. For example, it's a potent anti-inflammatory molecule. It inhibits what's called the NLRP3 inflammasome and so on. So it would have made sense if I had thought it through a little bit better, that maybe it might have a kind of like a dominant effect. So even if you don't change the diet and you don't put the mouse or the rat in real nutritional ketosis, you just supplement with beta hydroxybutyrate on top of everything.
You're making it sound like it's a very essential for our cells to have this. And I'm hearing that's why our body naturally kicks into this process when there's lack of food, because it's saying, hey, and correct me if I'm wrong, but do we also make beta hydroxybutyrate through some high intensity cardio and through supplementing with a really clean diet, even if it's not low carb?
Yeah, so I'm always thinking in terms of evolution as
Yeah.
well. How did we humans evolve? We didn't just like pop up on Earth, 50 years
Right.
ago or something like that, right? So this is a long process again, and it happened over millions of years, from early ancestors, and for the longest period of time where the human lineage evolved, we were hunter-gatherers, right? So our ancestors, way back then, they were hunting, meat, and whatever they were hunting, mammoths and big animals and so on. And they were also probably gathering some, if they didn't have any success hunting anything, they tried to supplement their diet with whatever else they could find. But primarily, our ancestors were actually top line kind of like hunters, and would have mostly consumed animal foods, but they would also have been in and out of ketosis. And this has been argued for a long time already, and is kind of understood by by paleontologists and archaeologists and so on, because obviously if you're depending on the hunt, you don't always have luck, and maybe one day you get a huge deer that you can hunt, and then for weeks you don't get anything. So those folks would have been in and out of ketosis and not eaten food for a long time, maybe had always pretty much one meal a day, potentially, at the most. And plus they would have moved a lot, right? So that's why you mentioned exercise. So what we do these days in the gym is what our ancestors would have done in their natural normal life, right? Because you have to run around to catch your prey, if you will. So I would say the current lifestyle in industrial societies is, of course, exactly pretty much the opposite, right? So instead of eating only occasionally, we're eating all the time. And instead of being in ketosis half of our life, we're in ketosis pretty much 0% of our life, most people. And instead of running around and exercising, we're doing that very little. We're sitting on our chairs like we do right now,
Yeah,
and
right.
spending our days like that. So the lifestyle and dietary habits would have really changed quite significantly. But it's clear that in our evolution, ketosis would have been an important part of our metabolism, and our bodies would have been exposed to beta hydroxybutyrate very frequently. And that doesn't happen anymore today for most people.
So with your ingredients and your products, knowing what you know, would you take this outside of any disease? Is a supplement essential to your diet?
Well, so I'm actually taking it every day.
So you do
um,
take it every day,
and I don't
even though
have
you,
kidney disease.
but
Right.
are the other ingredients in your formula for people every
Mhm.
single day, not just kidney disease?
Yeah, so we started out, of course, with polycystic kidney disease because that's where the research in my lab came from. And we actually formulated this product, that we're talking about, ketocitra, as to really go after a couple of different pathways. So the first one is ketosis, which is the reason why beta-hydroxybutyrate is in there. Another maybe equally important mechanism has to do with these microcrystals that can form in kidneys. So that's totally independent of ketosis. But everyone knows kidney stones, of course. They can be very common. But before a kidney stone becomes like a real stone, they start out as microscopic crystals. And these microcrystals that can form in kidneys, all day long, and they're very sharp and they can injure cells in the kidney. And what we had found is that these microcrystals really accelerate and worsen the disease progression in polycystic kidney disease. And to antagonize them, you can essentially just supplement with something really simple, which is citrate, citric acid. Because citric acid is the natural defense of our kidneys against these microcrystals. But most people, especially those with polycystic kidney disease, are relatively deficient in citrate. Their body does not filter enough citrate into the urinary space, so the kidneys are sort of defenseless and much more vulnerable to these microcrystals. So our medical food is essentially a combination of beta-hydroxybutyrate and citrate. Initially, formulated and designed for polycystic kidney disease, but we're we're quite convinced that it will be beneficial in essentially any form of chronic kidney disease, because really the underlying mechanisms of progression of the disease are really the same, no matter what the initial trigger is, whether it's a genetic mutation, whether it's type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, even hypertension and so on. Those are all kind of initial triggers that lead to chronic kidney disease. But then once the process has started, the mechanisms are the same. So we're very interested in not only clinical research for polycystic kidney disease, but also for other forms of chronic kidney disease.
So with people who are listening to this who are scientific researchers themselves, what advice do you have for them as they start out in their discoveries? As you said, I had a few aha moments. So what are your key insights and recommendations as people are doing their own discoveries that you would recommend for them?
Yeah, well, so for me personally, I only like to do research that, if it all works, as planned or hypothesized, makes a big impact, right? So as opposed to doing something where you just have an incremental advance and, you fill in a gap here and there. So I think, for a new researcher, to my mind, that's the most important thing, is the significance of what you're doing. What can the significance be if all goes well, right? So you have to come up with a bold hypothesis, and if the outcome of your experiment is, and if it confirms the hypothesis, that should be a significant discovery. Otherwise, leave it to other people to do that kind of
So
research.
focus on one thing and make it big and bold. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, make it big and bold, exactly right. But also be open to, things not working out the way you thought they would, and coming up with alternative explanations, and changing direction if something seems much more important all of a sudden, based on what we just learned. And that happens to us all the time in the lab. We do an experiment and we see the opposite of what we thought would happen. But then it's actually even more interesting and maybe more significant. And so we go after that. So it's important sometimes to be able to change directions and not, not be sort of like married to your own hypothesis, but saying, oh, what we thought, so far was completely wrong, and let's change our hypothesis and go after it in a different way.
Did you always want to be a researcher? So here you are in your youth exploring the options of career paths. And did you know, I want to be a doctor, or did that kind of evolve as you were in college and learning?
Yeah, it certainly evolved mostly by process of elimination, I would say. So I try, I figure out the things I wouldn't see myself doing forever. And everything is different for every person. Everyone has their own personalities. I'm not a big fan of like routine work, in and out every day the same thing. But so I like unpredictable things happening sometimes. So that's kind of what I prefer. Other people, and that's totally fine. Of course, other people like their routine, and they want to be done before at 5 o'clock and do something different. Why not?
Yeah.
That's just as honorable as anything else. So I think it's important to find a good match, for someone, personally, whatever works best for them, and where they can keep the motivation up at a high level and perform at a high level.
And in your free time, when you get it, I have heard you play the saxophone in a jazz band.
Yes, right. Yes.
And how long have you played for?
I started actually when I was maybe like 17-ish or something, high school, and pretty much out of the blue, and I thought, hey, I want to do something like that, and the saxophone seemed like a cool instrument to learn. So I'm mostly self-taught, I would say. Also, learned a few other instruments. I play some keyboard, some guitar, electric bass, and things like that. So, and it's a lot of fun. This is not professional. And that was probably also one of the, way back then, when I was in college, the considerations, do I want to be a scientist for the rest of my life, or a musician for the rest of my life?
A musician.
Right. But you can always be a musician for fun as an amateur playing in your garage with friends. But you can't really be a scientist in your own garage doing it for fun, but you have to go all the way.
I love that. It's kind of fun to know the professional in the face and the people behind an incredible brand and the great work you're doing at Santa Barbara Nutrients, and just the discoveries that have led you to help people. And through this, was there ever a moment where you thought, gosh, I don't know that this is right, and had those moments of doubts to where you guys didn't almost do a product with Go BHB in it?
I wouldn't say there were moments like that, I would be ready to give up,
Yeah.
because, that's difficult. If you're a researcher, you have to be pretty resilient to get through it, because things usually don't work. So even, if you're planning an experiment on the bench, you can pretty much count on it that for the first 10 times you try the experiment, it's not going to work. And you have to learn from the mistakes and the failures and improve and keep at it. So if somebody doesn't have the kind of perseverance, to get through an experience of where nothing works for quite a while, then you never get out the other end. So I think that's very important, not to get discouraged, and just keep at it and changing things and making them better, and eventually getting there. So that's kind of how things happened. There's always another way of finding success.
Sounds like researchers have a mental resilience too, because as you said, you keep trying and trying and trying, and the result isn't going to be always perfect the first time. So it sounds like kind of like that saying, you're never failing, you're just trying to find the win. So
yeah, exactly.
Where do you guys see yourself as a company going from here in the future of the research, and where you want to take, your products?
Mhm. Yeah, good question. So right now, so our product is not a drug, and not a supplement, but a medical food, which is its own sort of like a niche category of products that are regulated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. But the good thing is, a medical food is essentially considered safe because all the ingredients are approved ingredients, food ingredients, essentially, if you will. Which means you can put a medical food out in the market, very quickly. You don't have to get FDA drug approval, for example, because it's not a drug. So that's the good news, and we were able to do this really fast. So it took, I think it took about 9 months from after we raised funding for the company until the product was actually out on the market. So that's like lightning speed for a product like this. But the downside is that it's not a drug, and the problem is that kidney doctors they are used to prescribing drugs, and that they're very comfortable with that. And because a drug also gives them sort of like a safety cushion, if you will. It's FDA approved, so if something goes wrong with their patient not tolerating the drug, let's say, it's not the doctor's fault, because they just did what the FDA told them, essentially. But for medical foods, and it's the same actually for dietary advice. But if a doctor gives out dietary advice, that is not covered by the FDA or anybody. So it's a bit of a, doctors oftentimes fear that they're putting themselves out there, and they're recommending something that there isn't a fallback position. Usually they only recommend things that are either FDA approved or that are written in a guideline.
Isn't that interesting that they only prescribe within a guideline? And
that is unfortunately,
yeah.
It depends a little bit on the discipline. Some, like an integrative doctor, for example, they wouldn't care so much about diet guidelines and so on. But as it turns out, nephrologists are maybe on the more conservative spectrum of the medical profession. And most of them wouldn't do anything else that's not written in a guideline and that doesn't have an FDA approval. So that has been a problem because lots of doctors not only do not encourage their patients to try out dietary interventions and the medical food keto, etc., but they even actively discourage them, and they say, no, don't do this.
Which is really interesting, because food, if it's how we live and it affects us hormonally, signaling all of these things, wouldn't that be the first place we'd want to start? Well, it sounds like you did with your mice, yes. Right? Like, let's see how and then what's interesting is you talked about how these mice, it wasn't just the dietary foods, but it changed habits, which tells me it pivoted mindset in these mice, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you and I and reasonable people, I think we would all agree that if a dietary intervention has a reasonable chance of being effective without the side effects, that should be the first step, the first intervention to recommend to a patient. Some doctors don't think that way. Some doctors think that should be the last resort. You never. I can tell you stories. I've talked with colleagues, nephrologists, and one of them, for example, flat out told me he never recommends any dietary change to any of his patients because he thinks it's an imposition. It's not something that he has the right to do to make them change their diet. It makes my hair catch on fire if I hear that, because but who else would give dietary advice to a patient if not the doctor, right? So I think they're missing an opportunity to do some good, because the patient wants to get that kind of advice. They want to listen to their doctor. So I think as a doctor, you have one chance to do something good. That is when the patient is sitting there in front of you and listening and absorbing it and saying, tell me what I can do. And they're squandering the chance, if they're saying, oh, there's nothing you can do, forget about it, eat whatever you want, which I think there's enough data already to say that is actually bad advice, and that backfires and worsens the progression of something like polycystic kidney disease.
Really quite interesting. We are so excited for the work you guys are doing, and that's why I wanted to have you on here, is to just educate, because I think that's what it comes down to, is lack of education and resources provided, and then expanding minds for people to not think one way, but to kind of be open to nutritional foods that could really change your life. And so I'm excited. If people want to find your products, you guys go to santabarbaranutrients.com, and there's a lot of information on their website. And to sum it up, I always ask each one of my guests, do you have a favorite quote or a mantra or something that's kind of like your way of repeating it into your head for your purpose in life, or, your personal, I'm slipping on the word, like, what your value stand?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't have a quotable quote.
Yeah.
I just like to, never give up, if you will, and always find another way. Even if, and it's totally okay, if you run into a dead end road, just turn around and take the next road. But I don't like to give up, because if you do give up too early, you're missing that road potentially that could have led to success. I always try to find that road.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing.
Super. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you like what you heard, please share it and help us keep the conversation going. We can't grow without you. So, thank you in advance for your support of Power of Perseverance.